Firstly, thanks to everybody for joining. We appreciate you taking your time out. My name is Norman Newell. I'm the sales director for Renaissance. Been working with Renaissance about 15 years now. We've been working with usecure for about 5 years, found an extremely good solution, and I'm sure you'll enjoy today's webinar on human risk and AI threats. I know there's a lot of talk about AI at the moment, and I think it'll be one of those threats that will grow as the whole technology improves. So I'm looking forward to this. If you wouldn't mind going to the next, thanks, Nihal. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Everybody's being attended for this, muted for this session, but they will be unmuted for Q&A. We're going to record this because there are obviously sometimes people are unable to attend and you might want to view it afterwards anyway. If you have any questions during this, please send it into the chat or you can send them directly to myself. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nihal, who's going to take us through this. Thanks, Nihal.
Thanks, Norman. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining or watching this session as well. Appreciate it. So like Norman mentioned, today we'll be talking about the evolution in AI threats and the compliance response, and ultimately how we in the channel can leverage those evolutions and ultimately help our clients to be more aligned and more secure. So there is a 5-point agenda for today's session. Firstly, we're going to cover why humans are still such a risk factor. We've known about human risk for a long time. We've known it's an area of potential weakness in our client base. And yet the stats show that, if anything, we are getting less of a handle on the type of threats that our client staff members are experiencing. So we'll go through why humans are still such a risk factor. That leads us into 6 ways in which AI is evolving the human threat domain. As Norman mentioned, AI is evolving incredibly quickly. Human risk is no different. So we'll pinpoint a few key areas that it is specifically impacting human risk. That then leads us on to the regulatory response. So as we've seen these technological trends, how are laws and frameworks adapting to essentially guide how we are helping our staff members and our client staff members. We'll then go on to turning that risk into revenue. In the channel, it provides us an opportunity. So we'll go through compliance as a service, as a framework to help you to start monetizing this evolution. And then we'll go through some practical steps on how to get ahead of the curve as well. So a little bit of an introduction to usecure. So we are a human risk management vendor. Our entire focus is on understanding end users and their cybersecurity risks and giving repeatable, actionable steps to help reduce that risk. We want to develop end user behavior to make sure that human beings are not the weak point in an organization's cybersecurity posture. usecure is built for MSPs. We have built the product ourselves in-house. We've developed the product, developed the content. Everything that we do is geared towards allowing MSPs to scale with human risk management. We've been around for 9 years now. We've worked with Renaissance for around 5, and we now educate almost 500,000 users globally. So we essentially spend all day, every day, speaking with MSPs, speaking with their clients about the type of threats and the type of trends that they're experiencing. And like I mentioned at the start, human risk is evolving incredibly quickly. There are statistics and trends that show that not only is the threat evolving, but also how we should be reacting to those threats. The sort of best practices alongside them are also evolving. So that brings us on to why human risk is such a growing threat. And we've broken it down into 3 core areas here. Threats themselves are evolving, human error dominates breaches, and the attacks are growing in scale. Evolving threats is an absolutely crucial one. And so something that we'll go through a little bit later, as I touched on in the agenda, when we talk about things like AI. But we know cyber threats are becoming more sophisticated. They're becoming more frequent and they're becoming more targeted. What's always worked in our benefit previously is human-focused cyber attacks were incredibly time-consuming. To research an organization, to research an end user, to craft something tailored to that person took a lot of resource. Now, with the AI tooling that's out there, those barriers to entry are massively reduced. So we know, we see it firsthand. We see it in our own inboxes. We see what our clients and our partners' clients are reporting. These threats are becoming much more bespoke and much more sophisticated. It's a more visible threat than ever to SMBs. We also know human error dominates breaches. It's a factor in 95% of breaches. So when we think about security, beyond just human risk, we think about security as a whole. So much about it is about understanding the variables and controlling those variables. And yet human risk, human error is a pretty much universally recurring factor across breaches. And yet that statistic hasn't really moved. It hasn't really improved over time. So clearly the things that we're doing to help empower the end users isn't quite working as effectively as we'd hope. What compounds that is we know the attacks are growing in scale. So severe cyber attacks have tripled in the last 12 months. So what we have there, particularly with the evolving threats and the attacks growing in scale, is a rapidly evolving situation that our client staff members are facing. The sophistication, the frequency of those attacks is growing. And yet the sort of programs and the measures that we have in place to help those staff members has often stayed still. It's often the same type of processes that we were doing maybe 3 or 4 years ago when the attacks were much more generic and much more spray and pray. So that gap between the awareness levels and the sophistication of attacks is growing. And that's exactly what attackers are looking to exploit. So again, I think a recurring theme will be evolving threats and growing in scale. And we need to think about why those two will be occurring. And that leads us on to AI technology. As much as we are leveraging AI for productivity, for efficiency, for our own internal means, naturally, we know attackers can utilize those same functionalities, those same products for their own advantages. They can take the same tooling, they can remove a lot of the barriers to effective attacks. Information can be gathered and utilized with much greater speed and ultimately effectiveness. And this is a general trend and a problem in security, in that laws and defense and the sort of the mechanisms that we put in place are often reactive to cyber threats. Attackers get that first move advantage. They set the tone with the type of attacks that they can deploy, and we then often have to react. Really, what we want to do is try and be as proactive as possible, to try and look ahead, to try and get the right foundational frameworks in place that allow us to be more resilient, irrespective of how they evolve their attacks. So that brings us on to 3 critical AI threats that are targeting humans. So that's spear phishing, voice cloning, and deepfakes. Now, I appreciate those of you on this call will be aware of these different topics to varying degrees. So we won't go into too much details about the intricacies of voice cloning. Instead, what we'll focus on more is how these threats actually manifest for our clients. Something that we're very conscious of is, to us, the evolution in deepfake attacks or the dark web. And linking those evolutions with the real life trends that we see, that link can be relatively clear and a relatively smooth link. For our non-technical clients, understanding why they're experiencing what they're experiencing can sometimes be a bit technically overwhelming. They can feel the trends, they can see the trends, they can spot the evolution in the sophistication of the attacks. But if we go to them with technical jargon explaining why, it will often fall flat. So a big part of today's session is making sure that we can evolve how we speak to our clients about cyber threats and compliance. If we can effectively break down the real life impact of the elements that we have on the screen here, of the impact of compliance as well, things that can feel quite complex and can feel quite abstract. If we can break them down into tangible, digestible chunks that can relate to the real life things they're experiencing, the solution that we then go on to present becomes much more powerful. So spear phishing, as I touched on a couple of slides previous, is a huge driver behind the complexity of attacks. And again, we know with the AI tooling that's available, it removes a lot of the barriers to entry. So spear phishing, where it's much more tailored, much more targeted, much more bespoke to the end user, is now essentially the default. It's almost like it's mass personalization, which again, only a year or 2 ago would have been incredibly time consuming for an attacker. So we want to essentially use this as an example and use this as a foundational mechanism that explains the real life trends our clients are experiencing. The phishing attacks are getting much more personalized, much more bespoke, and using real life context to grab people's attention. So an example that we give when it comes to spear phishing, something which lays out the sort of step-by-step process of attackers, is let's say that I receive a weekly food delivery from HelloFresh. And let's say I get that delivery every single Thursday. If HelloFresh has a cyber incident, quite often what will happen is the people that sign up for their services, their information will be leaked on the dark web. So if I'm part of that data leak, often my email address, my home address, maybe some basic invoicing information will all be made publicly available. If I'm an attacker, that is absolute gold dust. That is specific context to me that will help the attacker to understand what services I use and what expectations I have around that service. So an attacker can use AI tooling to scrape the dark web and find that information within seconds. They can then collate that information and spit out a targeted phishing attack to me. So they would send me a phishing attack on Monday, looking like it's come from HelloFresh. And it will include the context that they've gathered from the dark web. It will say, your card details have now expired. In order to receive your scheduled delivery on Thursday, we need you to follow this link and update your card details immediately. If you don't do so within the next 24 hours, your scheduled delivery on Thursday to this address will not go ahead as planned. If I'm not paying attention, or if I haven't been trained on cybersecurity best practices, if I'm not aware of these kind of threats, that kind of specific context-driven attack is much more likely to grab my attention. I'm much more likely to click on that link and go through with it without really double-checking the sender address, for example. So these kind of context-driven spear phishing attacks are becoming much more common. And again, it helps that our clients, our SMB clients, are experiencing these more frequently. And if we can explain that it's the dark web and the data being scraped behind it, and that's what's informing these attacks, it then builds curiosity and understanding to see what other data might be out there. So it's important that we make that link nice and concise and clear for them. Voice cloning is something which has become more prominent. It doesn't require a lot of information. You just need 5 seconds of somebody's voice to be able to clone it with scary levels of accuracy. And to me, voice cloning is the best reflection of almost like the catch-22 with modern cybersecurity, because we do webinars like this. Like we want to be visible. We want to post on LinkedIn and put a face to our company and add a bit of personality and make us more accessible. At the same time, that provides a huge amount of data to an attacker. It informs them about our mannerisms, about our tone, about our voice, about the words we typically use. And again, that I think represents a catch-22. We shouldn't encourage our clients to not post on LinkedIn and not go to seminars and not increase a digital footprint in the right ways. But we have to make sure that it's an informed decision and that they understand the risks that come with putting themselves out there and how they can then combat the increase in that exposure. And then finally, we have deepfake attacks. And deepfakes, I think, are the best representation of the evolution in quality of attack over the last 6 to 12 months. It's still something which we don't see as prominently as spear phishing attacks in particular, but deepfakes are definitely starting to ramp up. Again, because of the amount of data out there on us, it makes it pretty easy for an attacker to replicate us on video calls. And companies that specialize in human risk, people who talk about this day in, day out, have fallen foul of these attacks. Like, it happens. A contemporary in our space, I don't say this to negatively highlight them, more just to highlight that it can happen to specialists, went through multiple rounds of interviews and hired someone through, again, video interviews. And only once they hired them did they realize they were a North Korean malicious actor. If a company who specializes in this, who speaks about this day in, day out, can go through multiple rounds of video interviews and not realize it's a deepfake attack, that is the biggest illustration we can possibly give to the quality of the attacks that we're seeing. And again, just a year ago or 2 years ago, that would have been a lot trickier to do, but now the quality of these attacks has evolved rapidly. So these are 3 sort of core threats that we can really highlight with our clients to emphasize how things have changed over the last year or two. And we also have a few different techniques that we can speak about to help explain ultimately the sort of underpinning processes behind those attacks. And there are 6 here on the screen, but there are 3 that I just want to touch on in a little bit more detail. Personalization is something that has been a recurring theme throughout this webinar so far, and for good reason. It's probably the biggest differentiator between a successful attack and an unsuccessful attack. And again, the ability to scrape that data, when I go back to that HelloFresh example, that would be me as a use case, but at the same time as gathering that information on me, an attacker could still build that same information on everyone else involved in that breach. So it's mass personalization now. Context awareness is a really important one, and something that we're seeing happen more and more frequently. What we mean by context awareness is, let's say in that HelloFresh example, let's say that I have had my password leaked and my personal email address leaked, or my business email address, sorry. If I've got lazy and repeated that same password for our internal Slack channel, an attacker could use that HelloFresh email and password combination and try to get into other systems. Let's say they get access to my Slack channel because I reused that password that's been leaked. Rather than sending malicious links immediately, attackers will sit in that environment and they will build context awareness. They will want to understand who I speak to. They will want to understand the topics that I speak to them about. They'll want to understand the tone of my messages, whether they're particularly formal or if I'm quite loose and use emojis and that kind of thing. By building that context awareness, it means when they then try to impersonate me, they will replicate my writing style, my tone, my formality in much more accuracy. To my colleague that then receives that malicious attack through Slack, all of the context's red flags they'd be looking out for are taken away from them. It's come from a legitimate source. It's come from my Slack. It sounds like me. It has my tone. It has the right level of formality, and it speaks about the topics that we would normally speak about. For that recipient of the attack, it is much more difficult for them to spot that malicious attempt. And then the final one that I wanted to touch on is evasion techniques. Ultimately, the attack is only, the phishing attack, for example, is only effective if it gets in front of the end user. We can have the most tailored, targeted phishing attack. If the email security product filters it out, it doesn't really matter. And attackers naturally are very aware of this and are trying to get ahead of it. So AI helps in designing phishing emails that actually bypass spam filters and security measures in the first place. But it also allows them to constantly learn and adapt to security protocols or patching updates. And that makes it much harder for traditional security tools to detect that phishing attack in the first place. And we then have, obviously, reliance on the end user to be that layer of security and spot that attack. So all of that combined, the fact that we have an increase in spear phishing, in voice cloning, and in deepfake attacks, the fact that we have this increased personalization, they have these evasion techniques to make sure that these attacks get in front of the end user. They combine to have a few really critical impacts. And we've summarized that here on this slide. 6 key human risk impacts that happen as a result of what we spoke about so far. So we believe that people are the new perimeter. Technology is absolutely vital. Infrastructure is critical, and it will always be critical. At the same time, we've seen time and time again that a lot of organizations focus on the infrastructure alone and don't supplement it with the human layer. So if the infrastructure is bypassed, they have a recipient who hasn't been primed about what to look out for. We should supplement technology with people. If we have the 2 elements of security working in conjunction and crossing over each other's weak points, all of a sudden we have a much more cohesive ecosystem for our clients. We have an ecosystem that is covering each other's weaker points. At the moment, though, we know we have huge awareness gaps. Nearly a third of employees receive training only once a year or less. Realistically, is that end user any more secure? Are their habits any different 6 months later if they've just received training once a year? A lot of employees also don't know what's expected of them. They often haven't been communicated what key processes they have. If they receive a suspicious email, do they know what processes and what responsibilities they have, or do they just cross off that email? What links into this is we know there is a low level of data awareness. A lot of staff members just don't realize how much risk they provide, how much access they have, how much interesting information they have access to. And we also think there's a lack of accountability. When it comes to human risk, quite often they just don't realize they have an active part to play in the infrastructure. And you can't really blame them ultimately if they haven't been told that they have these processes to follow. They have these best practices that are expected of them. Why would they ultimately go out of their way to deploy those type of things? So we have to try and build a culture. We have to try and build awareness in the end users and accountability so that they understand that, yes, technology is there to help them out, but they also have an active role to be vigilant, to be proactive, and to, again, supplement the technology that has been put in front of them. The good news is that all of this combined, those real life threats that SMBs are experiencing, the awareness gaps that we're talking about, we are seeing an inflection point. We are seeing SMBs realize that this is something which maybe they've turned a bit of a blind eye to, but it's getting harder and harder to ignore not having the right sort of process in place for the end users. So we see SMBs now are increasingly open to having this conversation, are increasingly concerned about how they can tighten up their human risk measures. And that brings a brilliant opportunity for us. What also helps to speed this up is that there is more external pressure than ever. And that's where compliance comes into it. We know compliance is becoming a huge pain for SMBs. And what we often find is that technological trends, real life trends, evolve incredibly quickly. They're unbound by things. They are just bound by the technology and the way in which people think about it. So they can evolve rapidly and unshackled. And what then happens is the compliance response happens with a delay. Often there is that gap where the real life trends we're experiencing and the frameworks that guide us have a disparity. So societal change moves incredibly fast, regulation moves slower. What we're seeing, though, is a crossroads. We are now seeing compliance around human risk catching up to the real life trends that we're experiencing. And ultimately, we know compliance is something which most clients are not set up for. It's something which they don't have the resource to commit to properly. It's also something which causes them a massive headache. They don't want to deal with the complexity of compliance. They don't want to spend time understanding how compliance impacts them and what steps they should taken and get in place. They're ultimately looking for support. They're looking for someone that can alleviate the stress of compliance on them. And that's where we come into it. Human risk management or security awareness training is a requirement across multiple global standards. Of those listed on the screen here, all of them reference cyber awareness training or human risk management as a requirement. It's no longer optional. It's no longer a security best practice. It is a mandated thing to have in place. Again, this provides us with a huge opportunity. In the channel, we often think about different value propositions, different ways of evolving, different ways of staying ahead and ensuring that we can keep driving value for our clients. Compliance is something which they know they will have to get on top of and often don't have the resource to do on their own. It makes complete sense they will look for their MSP for help. So we need to make sure that we're aware of the type of frameworks that are impacting them and have ready-made solutions in place to make this less of a headache for them. So before we go over a bit of a framework about how we can actually help them, I wanted to touch on three core frameworks or legislative changes that are impacting the Irish market. So we have NIS2 and DORA as our essentially our laws. And then we have CAS controls as our overarching framework. NIS2 is a huge, extensive directive that is impacting companies in Europe. There are 15 different industries that are covered. There is a strong chance that you will have clients that are impacted and that are part of those 15 industries. Things like banking, energy, utilities, transport. They're designed to cover those industries for a reason. Those are the industries which are typically the most at risk and typically the most targeted. So NIS2 speaks about the need for social engineering training, for human risk awareness training. It also talks a lot about policy measures. It talks about needing to get processes in place to make sure that the organization has the preparation that it needs and the processes it needs to reduce risk and ultimately show alignment with that framework. So again, when we speak about the lack of accountability in the employee base, a lot of that is driven by just simply not being told what's expected of them. NIS2, as well as DORA and CIS controls, essentially mandate that people are informed about what's expected of them. It also mandates that they have security incident handling procedures, so that if something does go wrong, they have a ready-made playbook to revert back to and help get them back on track. So NIS2 is something which is relevant to, I think, over 100,000 companies. It's a huge directive. It covers, again, those 15 different industries. So it's absolutely something which we should be tapping into. If you don't speak about compliance already, NIS2 is a really accessible and really broadly relevant framework, or law, sorry, to tap into. Moving on to DORA. So DORA is more impacting financial institutes. But again, there are quite a lot of crossovers between NIS2 and DORA. Again, DORA has a reference towards security awareness training. It expects it to be proactive awareness, so getting ahead of the threat, making sure that we're reducing the risk before it turns into an issue. And again, it talks about process. It talks about incident handling. It talks about risk management. Essentially, it is acknowledging the need for more formalization around human risk. And then finally, we have CIS controls. Now, CIS controls are not a mandated thing. It is instead an overarching guideline, an overarching framework. CIS is a brilliant reference point to help do essentially like a gap analysis on an organization. It covers multiple different controls and different vectors. User awareness, user training, security awareness and skills training is an entire control on its own. So just as something like penetration testing has its own control, security awareness training also has its own dedicated space where it speaks about the need for sort of user relevant, up-to-date awareness training. Again, it is essentially reflecting the trends that we're seeing and the need for a response. And again, interspersed throughout CIS controls is the need for policies, is the need for process. So even in things that aren't directly relevant to end user awareness, it still has an undercurrent of the need to formalize process and make sure that people are aware of what's expected of them. So I appreciate if you haven't looked into these three, it can be sometimes a little bit overwhelming to know where to start with compliance. A really easy trick is to identify the recurring things across them. And NIS2, DORA, and CIS all talk about security awareness training, and they all talk about the need for formalizing process. If we can make sure that is a core part of our messaging and a core part of the evolution that we're trying to encourage, it will stick with our clients. So ultimately what this does is it presents us with an opportunity. And there, again, are a few different ways that we can leverage this when we come to speaking to our clients about this. As I mentioned earlier, we feel like human risk management has reached a genuine inflection point. It is shifting from something which is seen as a medium priority from SMBs, something which they know they probably should do something about, but they delay until an incident occurs or an audit comes up. That mindset is absolutely shifting. A lot more SMBs now are understanding that there's only so long they can ignore it. And actually now the time is coming to move forwards and be proactive. The key is to present them with a solution that actually plugs the gaps that they're looking for. Part of what accelerates this is legislative pressure. As we touched on the previous slide, we know there is external mandation that tells them this is no longer optional. You have to get these things in place in order to be compliant. This ultimately allows us to evolve the MSP role. We can position ourselves as being the proactive partner in reducing human risk and in building compliance. And ultimately, we have a compelled audience. We know our clients are more aware about these threats than ever because of the evolution in AI, because of the real life trends they're experiencing, and because of the compliance response. Now, if we get this right, if we evolve ourselves in the channel, there are two really clear benefits. Beyond just actually making our clients secure, we will ring fence our clients because we embed human risk management, we add extra value, we evolve our offering. So our clients are more likely to stick with us, but also it means that we have a new revenue stream. We can offer human risk management and compliance as an ongoing billable service that will ultimately take that headache away from your clients. So as I mentioned at the start, we want to touch on a bit of a framework to help you on that process. It can be quite difficult to know where to start. It can be quite difficult to know how to incorporate this into your offering. So what we're seeing a massive movement towards is compliance as a service. It's absolutely gaining momentum, and it is the most structured way of delivering compliance measures to your clients. So before I go through compliance as a service, I just wanted to touch on that this is in my opinion, this is the goal to work towards. It doesn't necessarily have to be, if you're doing nothing in compliance, going from absolutely nothing to compliance as a service. We can build towards it with steps, but it often helps to know what the end goal is to then know what the incremental steps should be. And we've seen it before. Some of our biggest partners are using compliance as a service as a way to differentiate and grow with their client base. So compliance as a service is essentially a purpose-built offering around compliance. It's where you as the MSP will look at your client base. You'll understand the industries they tend to operate in and what compliance frameworks and legislations are relevant to them. You can then collate that information and essentially build a managed offering that helps them get in line with the relevant frameworks or laws. So it would incorporate looking at your vendor stack and making sure that you have the right products in place that allow you to deliver what the frameworks require. You can then spot gaps in your portfolio and find vendors that help to plug those gaps. CIS is a brilliant way of doing a self-assessment and looking at the controls that CIS talks about and understanding whether you as an MSP have the vendors in place that allow you to meet those different requirements. So you assess the client base, you find the right vendors and make sure you have the right stack around it. You can then bundle those vendors together as a compliance offering. And you also wrap different services around it. So typically that would include things like ongoing reporting. Maybe you'll do a QBR around compliance with your clients. And you'll tell them, it's often a movement to get yourself aligned with compliance. Every quarter, we'll have a catch up and discuss the measures we've put in place and what still needs to be done. What this does is for your clients, it gives them the peace of mind to know there is a subject matter expert that has taken the time to craft something specifically for this exact scenario. It's something that relates to them, to what actually applies to them as an organization. And here is a ready-made bundle that takes that headache away from them. If we can offer this out, it increases client value and stickiness as well. So it essentially turns compliance from something which people are avoiding to a certain degree to something which they will happily pay for to ultimately not have to deal with it because their MSP has a dedicated bundle in place for them. If we incorporate compliance effectively, we have some really key impacts essentially. Firstly, those that deliver compliance services reduce security incidents by 60%. The bottom line is we're making our clients more secure by implementing these measures. These measures exist for a reason. MSPs that offer compliance services charge 20 to 50% more. It's worth noting that that isn't compliance as a service, it is just simply compliance services. And those that offer compliance services see higher retention, 20 to 30% faster MRR growth. And at the same time, we know less than 50% of MSPs offer managed services. It's a huge amount of green space for ultimately something which isn't going away, and that is mandated that your clients will get aligned with. So it's a huge opportunity for us. That then leads nicely into how we can support you. So what does usecure offer that aligns with these AI threats, that aligns with the compliance response, and ultimately helps you to plug those gaps with as minimal admin overhead as possible? So here we have a summary of the usecure product. We have a 3-step process of evaluate, empower, and calculate. And again, the overarching sort of theme throughout the product is identifying human risk and reducing it. It's a very simple process that we want to, or fundamentals we want to get right, but that essentially underpins how we go about our human risk management program. Evaluate, empower, calculate. Evaluate is an incredibly important step that is often neglected. Some of your clients might have looked into human risk management platforms before, or security awareness training and simulated phishing platforms. And quite often, one of the issues with traditional awareness programs is they treat everybody the same. They are a generic one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't really account for individuality. When we're talking about human risk, as we've seen in the presentation, there are so many different elements, there are so many different risk vectors within human risk that we can't afford to treat each person as the same, because everybody will have their own individual strengths and their own individual weaknesses. So we want to move away from that traditional one-size-fits-all approach. And instead, we want to understand each person as an individual. Only once we understand each person as an individual can we then build tailored training programs. So to understand each person, we send everyone a gap analysis questionnaire. On day one, they receive a 10 to 15-minute quiz. It's not too intense at all. But that quiz is designed to give us a reference point, to understand for each person in core competencies in cybersecurity where their level of awareness sits at the start. This is then used to inform how we empower those users. And the most obvious link is with the risk-adapted user training. So, for example, if the gap analysis identifies that my weakest topic is secure passwords, secure passwords training will be the first module that I receive. Whereas if my colleague's weakest topic is social media, that will be the first training course they receive. So each user has risk-adapted training based on their individual strengths and weaknesses. Really helps to get that client buy-in to be able to tell them that it is actually personalized based on each individual user. The training itself is bite-sized. It's a 3-minute video and then a quiz at the end. So it takes me about 7 minutes to complete. It reduces the barrier to entry, but it also allows us to do bite-sized continual reinforcement. We want to make this just a continual process. So again, going back to that idea about building a culture, building awareness, if we drip feed this over time, people will do the courses, and we also reinforce best practices continually. We want to supplement that with targeted spear phishing campaigns. As we touched on earlier, spear phishing is still the most common threat, and we want to replicate that in a safe environment. So we have built phishing attacks, including those for the Irish market, that replicate the type of threats we see in real life. In a safe environment, you can then run those phishing attacks and identify the most at-risk users. So when it comes to human risk management and when it comes to security awareness programs, training and phishing are the two that people tend to gravitate towards the most. And understandably, right, they are fundamental, foundational parts of an awareness program. And when done correctly, they are absolutely vital. As we've seen, though, throughout the presentation, AI and compliance is now playing a huge part in human risk. So we have to make sure that we go beyond just training and phishing, and we have measures in place that allow us to cover those more modern threats. So we incorporate dark web monitoring as part of the platform. If we go back to that HelloFresh example, if I'm involved in a breach with HelloFresh, we will find that breach and we will alert you as an MSP to tell you this client and this user have been involved in a breach, and this is the information that we found on them. We're essentially replicating the processes that attackers follow, but we're getting ahead of it. We are finding the information before an attacker does. And then we also offer simplified policy management. And when we think about DORA, NIS2, and CIS, process is a recurring theme. So with our policy management tool, we have around 40 different templates preloaded. That includes things like a email policy, a password policy. We can build a disaster recovery plan, for example. And we can send that to staff members and track when they view and when they sign the document. Not only does it get end user buy-in because they're being informed about what's expected of them, an auditor is going to be happy because we can prove that we not only have this documentation, that we not only send it to staff members, but they actually give their informed consent. So the four of those combine to give us a comprehensive human risk management platform that adapts to individuals, that covers the AI threats we're seeing, and also helps them to get in line with compliance requirements. All of this is automated. We've set the product up in literally 15 minutes before, and it will just manage itself in the background for you. Underpinning all of this in step 3 is human risk analytics. It's really hard to contextualize risk. It's really hard to put a number on cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So we take all engagement in the platform and give a risk score. It essentially helps to contextualize the data that we find on your clients, and we can show month-on-month trending data. You can build branded reports that you can incorporate in your QBRs that essentially shows your clients the value in what you're providing around human risk, the work that's been done so far, and the vulnerabilities that need to be addressed going forward. So that essentially is our human risk management platform. And we find there are 5 fundamental impacts that come as a result of it. Effective human risk management keeps pace with evolving threats. These threats are evolving incredibly quickly. We have a team that builds content consistently and allows us to keep up to date. It turns compliance from a tick box exercise into something that actually enables culture change. We know that continuous training, phishing simulations, and policy engagement reduces human-led breaches. We want to get that 95% involvement down as low as possible. If we do this effectively, humans supplement the technology and become another layer of defense. And it also provides you with a competitive advantage. We know human risk is more prominent. We know compliance is more of a headache now. If we can combine those 2 pain points into one product, all of a sudden we have a competitive advantage. So I appreciate it's a lot of information on this session today. And that's why we want to break down 5 core steps to take now. If you're a bit unsure about what to do with this information, if you're unsure about how to take this and evolve your offering and evolve your knowledge levels internally, these are 5 steps we'd recommend to take. The first one, as I just touched on, is raise your knowledge levels internally. Make sure that anybody that is customer facing understands the evolution in threats when it comes to human risk and the compliance response. This doesn't have to be anything incredibly in-depth. It's just understanding the fundamentals of what applies and how it impacts your clients in their day-to-day. Step 2 is to then identify offerings that make sure you are covering the relevant legislation. We can then develop a human risk management, or if we have the resource and the capacity to go for a full compliance as a service offering, we want to make sure that we have some sort of offering, some sort of service that essentially plugs that gap. We also want to create education-based marketing campaigns. Yes, there is a rise in visibility about these threats, but we shouldn't just lead with product marketing. We should still embed the value proposition around this. We should still do education-based marketing campaigns that speaks about the threats we've spoken about today, that speaks about the compliance and frameworks that we've spoken about today, and help to reinforce that this isn't something which is just a cybersecurity month initiative. It's something which is just now a modern part of cybersecurity. And then supplement that, we want a consistent client outreach plan. We want to make sure that we are reinforcing this continually throughout the year as something which needs client attention. Okay, so before we move on to the Q&A, we just have a brief summary here for you. So again, we know AI is accelerating both the sophistication and the frequency of human targeted attacks. As a result, compliance standards are now catching up. They are mandating human risk management and security awareness training. They are moving what we speak about as best practice to just a core requirement. This gives you in the channel a huge window to deliver change, to plug that gap, and to help to build a security culture and value around compliance. And if we get that right, we drive stronger client security, higher retention rates, and recurring revenue growth. As a next step, you can book a demo with our team using that QR code. Renaissance offer free NFR accounts too, so you can play around with the product in your own time, make sure it covers what you need and what your clients might be looking for. And if you have any questions, we now have a Q&A session as well. So if there's anything you'd like to find out more about how we operate, how we work with Renaissance, the compliance frameworks, feel free to fire away.
Neil, thanks very much. That was very interesting. It's funny you mentioned the interview process earlier on as well, and AI. We actually advertised a job about a month or two ago, and one of the interviewees turned out to be AI.
How did you spell it?
Well,
How did you figure out?
it just felt too. We asked the question, there was a gap, and then the answer came, but it was kind of very staccato, you know. But you really had to think about it, you know. And I would suggest it's just going to get better and better. But I'd love to have employed the person who were really good. It really answered the questions well, you know.
Yeah, maybe we should just turn into the slide.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it was very, very interesting. I suppose you'd mentioned there about education-based marketing campaigns. What sort of resources are available for somebody that wants to build those campaigns, please?
Yeah, it's something we spend a lot of time on. Our internal marketing team essentially build a ton of resources, not only around the product, but around like education-based marketing. So that includes things like industry statistics. It includes case studies around breaches and the actual flow about how that breach happened. We also include compliance one pages as well. So if we know DORA is relevant to your clients, we can send you a one pager that just explains in non-technical jargon why it's relevant. Our marketing team can also co-brand them for the partner. So if they send over their logo, maybe their contact information, we can make it look completely white labeled for the partner. Essentially just makes it easier for them to start talking about this.
That's perfect. Yeah. I suppose the other thing is we all have to look to how people spend their money and our clients. So is there a business case that we can help our partners build? Is a way of doing that?
Yes, and part of the reason why that's so important is even though we have that rise in threat visibility and that increased motivation, I guess, in SMBs, still there can be a little bit of a detachment from like people see the stats, but they think like that, yeah, okay, that's relevant, but it won't really impact us. And so data is the absolute critical thing to do. So there's a few things that we can do. We can take the company domain and we can just run a scan against that domain. We can see some emails that we might find involved in some breaches and maybe the passwords that have been leaked. We can also find what services somebody uses based on their domain, essentially mimicking the type of research phase that an attacker would follow. MSPs can also build a prospecting report. We can help them to build a white labeled step-by-step report that will do some dark web monitoring, will do some domain monitoring. And a spear phishing attack is just the best way to show risk. If you have a client that has reported a phishing attack and they were proactive about it, it's great that they identified it. But if that attack went to one of their colleagues, maybe their colleague wouldn't have been quite as savvy. So a really useful thing to do is go to that client and say, we can take that email, we can replicate it in a safe environment, and we can send it to everyone. Let's see if we just got fortunate that one person spotted it, and maybe we'd been less fortunate if it went to one of their colleagues. And that then gets that buy-in because it has real life validity. Like it's not based on theory, it's based on something that they've actually experienced. If we can then show who it was sent to, how they engaged with it, all of a sudden it becomes quite hard to ignore a statistic that is relevant to that specific company. So yeah, data is absolutely key to get that motivation going.
Great stuff. No, that seems to be the end of the questions now, Neil. Thanks very much for that. I enjoyed it, and this will be sent out to everybody as well, and it'll be available on demand. So thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Norman. Thanks everyone for your time.